take a moment to establish our motivation, thinking of the purpose of our time to be to study the Lamrim, the sutra teachings of the Buddha, organized by great masters for our benefit, to give us reliable, repeatable, easily understood method to transform our own minds into minds of fully awakened beings. And we think that the purpose of accomplishing that is not for one's own benefit alone, but primarily to unlock our own capacity to be of perfect benefit to sentient beings. Being able to use that state of enlightenment to lead all ordinary sentient beings to their own enlightenment. So we develop the attitudes of faith and refuge and bodhicitta. Right? So we are continuing in the section on training in refuge, and we are in a sort of subsection on the qualities of the Buddha, the extraordinary qualities of the historical Buddha, the wheel-turning Buddha of our era, to demonstrate that the Buddha is a Dharma jewel, is one of the three jewels, is one of the three jewels of refuge. It constitutes one of the three jewels of refuge. The reasons why we can rely on the Buddha and think of the Buddha as a valid part of the three jewels of refuge. So we are on. Sorry, there was a waiting room and I clicked and sorry. Okay. So we are on day 144. The next couple contemplations will relate to the Buddha's body, speech, and mind, looking at these individually as aspects of the extraordinary qualities of the Buddha. So day 144, Lama Zopa says, just by seeing Guru Shakyamuni's Guru Shakyamuni Buddha's holy body, we can achieve a state of great bliss and pacify all our delusions. So here he's I think it seems like seems to me primarily referring to those people who actually got to do that. The people who were alive at the time, uh, not necessarily, um, not necessarily images, that we have, but to think of actually beholding the Buddha's body in person, because you hear the teachings on the major and minor marks of a Buddha, um, and not all of those are, and to some degree, practitioners of different capacities, different meditative capacities, can observe different aspects of the Buddha's body. Those that are more obscured, who have more, obscuration in their own mind, the Buddha's body might appear, one way, and then the more you purify the mind, the more of those qualities you can observe. Um, He says, Lama Zopa says, we can study the symbolism of all the different aspects of a Buddha's body, but we don't need to know about this to receive its benefits. We are comforted just by seeing the crown protrusion, the long ears, and the wide, gentle eyes. We are naturally inspired when we begin to understand how these symbolize the incredible qualities of a Buddha. We want to behave in a way that will lead us also to develop these qualities and gain the body of a Buddha. Just the sight of a Buddha image can be the trigger for us to set out on the journey to enlightenment. So here, that kind of, there's, again, in the Lamrim Chenmo, they do go into detail about the major and minor marks of a Buddha, and you can study those in more detail. And again, not all of those, but Lama Zopa is saying, even to some degree, like when we do the meditation on the Buddha, there are a few of those qualities that are described, and then there are others that are more hidden. But even, Lama Zopa is saying, even for us, yeah, Aaron.
So when we're contemplating the qualities of the Buddha, are we supposed to be thinking about the physical qualities or like the idea of the qualities in our minds, like what they are and what they mean?
So with this one, a wheel turning Buddha is said to have the 84 major marks and the minor signs. And all of those so those are to some degree physical manifestations, or visible, at least they're identifiable, visible manifestations but each of those major and minor marks and signs, they have a particular karmic history. They are the result of the Buddha's training over countless, not truly countless, but over a great many lifetimes of training. That training results in the major and minor marks of a wheel turning Buddha. So an ordinary person who achieves enlightenment, they don't necessarily show the 84 major and minor marks of a Buddha, but a wheel turning Buddha is going to have those, those marks and signs. And so what Lama Zopa is saying is that some of those are included in paintings and stupas, or paintings and statues or tankas, and also in the written descriptions that you find in meditations. And even just for those, if we read about, that the karmic causes and conditions that must have existed over incredibly long periods of the Buddha's training in previous lives, then that can be a real source of incredible inspiration to think of the morality that, he practiced, the patience that he practiced, all of the training that he engaged in that are actually the karmic causes of the manifestation of the major marks and minor signs. With respect to this contemplation, this is referring literally to the Buddha's body, the physical manifestation of that training, all of the reasons why he has the Ushnisha, the reasons why all of the different major marks and signs are present in the form of a wheel turning Buddha like Shakyamuni Buddha. So this specific contemplation is referring to the physical form, but primarily referring to being inspired by the karmic history that his physical form is the embodiment of. And again, in the sutras, there are many stories of, the luminosity of the Buddha's body and how subdued people, like in the quotation, Lama Zopa is talking about how people who met the Buddha, and it seems kind of mystical and strange in a way, but it is that karmic history. It is all of that training, which kind of, and he also, in the next contemplation, he talks about the Buddha's speech. The Buddha's speech in day 145, where there's different qualities of enlightened speech. One is that the Buddha is able to give the teaching that is the most suitable for the disciple's mind, because they know the disciple's mind, and the teaching that they give is specifically for that disciple, which is why in the sutras, why we need to have the Lamrim, because in the sutras, all of those discourses were discourses given by the Buddha to whomever was in front of the Buddha. And because there was such a huge diversity of student that the Buddha met over that long period of his teaching, the recorded teachings are kind of all over the place. There isn't, and for us, it's so incredibly beneficial to have great masters like Atisha, Lama Tsongkhapa, go through all of that and organize it in a way that can be used in a much more user-friendly, kind of logical way than just having to wade through sutras that don't even in the way that they organize the books of the sutras, there's not a lot of real logic behind, they have like the short discourses and the long discourse. I mean, just organizing them by length is silly, but that's kind of how they did it. So you get these books of the sutra, and the way that the sutras are organized, you read one and then you read the other, and there's no progression, there's no consistency, they're just different ideas, so all of the wisdom is there, but for us, incredibly difficult to make sense of it. But that's what the Lamrim does for us, is extract all of that meaning. But that's one of the extraordinary qualities of the Buddha's speech, is that he doesn't, any wheel-turning Buddha wouldn't have to just guess or say the same thing to everyone. They would be able to tailor exactly what they say to the mind of the individual disciple. And then also they talk about how, irrespective of the language that either the Buddhas can actually speak, in every language, or they speak in a way where, regardless of what language that person speaks, they understand. So their speech conveys the meaning, either like when it gets processed by that person's mind, or literally, I don't know exactly what they mean by that, but because they say kind of simultaneously that the Buddha can speak, and all of the different people in the audience, they may not all speak the same language, but they understand in their own language what the Buddha spoke. So that's a more of like an energetic aspect of one mind to another mind, and how that mind is processing what's being expressed. Um, he says the wisdom. He says it's the Buddha's wisdom that gives a Buddha's speech its power. Such power, he says, has nothing to do with an ordinary person's eloquence. It is solely a matter of inner realizations. Since the Buddha is one whose realizations are complete, their speech has the power to affect each listener in a profound and deeply personal way. Not only that, but an enlightened being can arouse understanding without having to use any words at all. So, again, in the sutras, you find examples of, just a gesture, the Buddha making just a gesture or a look, and communicating, and then the disciple gets some insight due to just the Buddha doing a particular mudra or looking at them in a certain way. Um, and you find examples of that even more recently. They talk about um, people being in the presence of great masters and potentially enlightened beings, and getting some realization of what was being said when that teacher just looked them in the eyes or something. uh, so that's, again, an energetic level of communicating. Okay. And then day 146, Lama Yeshe says, Buddha is the totally opened mind, the state beyond confusion. So this again is the Buddha's body, speech, and now mind. So he says, practically speaking, Buddha means omniscient wisdom, wisdom that pervades all universal reality. There is no dark shadow of ignorance in the Buddha's wisdom. When we talk about the power of the Buddha, the perfect power to lead all sentient beings into the perfect state. The enlightened power Buddhism talks about is that which controls or conquers the ego, which is the most difficult thing. And then he says, finally, there's the Buddha's universal compassion and love. He says, our compassion is very partial. We have compassion for our partner, our relatives, our parents. Our compassion is limited, but the Buddha's compassion is limitless and embraces all living beings. So, any questions so far about the Buddha's, these aspects of the qualities of a Buddha, or last week, anything that we said?
So when we're contemplating the qualities of a Buddha, what are we just thinking about the qualities in isolation, like how awesome this is?
So the goal is to develop a sense of being able, having confidence in refuge is another way of um, saying confidence. So being able to relate to enlightened mind, enlightened activity, as being completely reliable, completely infallible. And so these qualities are aspects of that kind of infallible source of refuge. They are examples of that we can point to and say, by contemplating all of these, I am able to give rise internally to a sense of confidence that the historical Buddha, enlightened beings in general, are an infallible source of refuge and protection. Um, Given, as we talked about, the origin of refuge is fear of suffering, and then training in faith, training in faith that um, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, as the three jewels, together are able to present me with a path out of that suffering, a path that prevents that suffering, either on my behalf, which is kind of the Theravadan, level of refuge, or the Mahayana level of refuge in terms of a path for all sentient beings, a path that we not only can use to prevent our suffering, but a path that we can use to accomplish a state that will allow us to prevent the suffering of any sentient being or all sentient beings. So these are just examples or manifestations of what the Buddha has accomplished, that demonstrates that the Buddha is not just a regular, ordinary, fallible kind of, maybe they have some good ideas, maybe maybe the Buddha said some useful things, but to go beyond that and to recognize that the Buddha achieved the state of enlightenment, and the state of enlightenment is what I can have confidence in, is what the Buddha is expressing, and that is not just a normal level of education or study or um, you know familiarity with beneficial ideas, but it is actually a fully infallible, completely reliable source of what will completely protect me from suffering, and will allow me to protect others from suffering. Um, my teacher at one point, he said that if we, like, when we were a child and we were, there was maybe we skinned our knee, or there was a thunderstorm, and we kind of instantly thought of our mother. And we were like, because if we were alone, or we were, we were outside, and we felt that sense of separation and that sense of, and we instantly thought, well, I wish my mother was here to, if we start to think of the Buddha like that, then we can see some progress in our training in refuge. When we think of the sufferings of samsara, when we think of our own difficulty, if our mind goes to the Buddha in that same way, then we can see that we've started to think about the Buddha as that source of refuge, the way that a small child would turn to their parent. Any other questions? So day 147, again, still on the Buddha jewel. Of the three jewels, we'll be going through the Dharma jewel and the Sangha jewel also, but still on the first, the Buddha jewel. This is talking about the Buddha's ability to manifest, that the historical Buddha was one manifestation of the Dharmakaya mind of the historical Buddha, but the quote is, the Buddha manifests in whatever way most benefits, depending on the karma of the being. So, we've talked in the section on guru devotion and so on, that enlightened beings in that aspect, in their nirmanakaya aspect, are manifesting in that specific form because of our karma, because we only possess the karma to relate to them if they choose and if they're able to show that particular karmic manifestation. And so Lama Zopa goes on to say that the Buddha manifests in many ways, both animate and inanimate, in order to benefit us. Where there is a need for a bridge or a boat, the Buddha manifests as these things. If there's a need for rain, the Buddha's holy mind takes the form of a rain cloud. Whenever a virtuous thought arises in our mind, this is the action of the Buddha's holy mind. The Dharma books that we can easily obtain in many different languages are manifestations of the Buddha. So, of course, we can understand that in different ways, in terms of everything that exists of the Buddha's teachings is passed down through generations of realized masters and transmitted in a pure, unbroken lineage to the present moment. But then also, that it is that there are ways in which that's also literally meant to be true, that omniscient mind, Dharmakaya mind, isn't limited like our mind. Dharmakaya mind can literally take the aspect of different forms, human forms, animal forms, and even inanimate forms. Like, if you were to come across, if a practitioner comes across, a place to drink when their life was in danger, could be the Buddha manifesting that particular place to get food or drink, or something that protects or creates safety. So the Buddha is able to manifest in inanimate and also animate forms for the benefit of sentient beings. So it could be, you find a Dharma book on the subway, could be the Buddha manifesting that particular Dharma book just for your mind to read that day or something. So that is actually the last contemplation of the Buddha jewel. We're now going into the Dharma jewel. Any thoughts or questions on the Buddha jewel? And like I said, you do find more detailed examples of the Buddha's qualities in something like the Lamrim Chenmo, if you were to look at that section of the Lamrim Chenmo. Okay. So now we'll start the section on the Dharma jewel. So Lama Zopa says the definition of Dharma is whatever is an antidote to our delusions. He says Dharma is a Sanskrit word that means not just the teachings of the Buddha, but anything that leads us from suffering to happiness. The relative Dharma jewel is the 84,000 teachings shown by Guru Shakyamuni Buddha that explain the different levels of cessation, the 5 paths, the 10 grounds, and so forth. These are divided into 3 baskets: Vinaya, morality and discipline; Abhidharma, philosophy; and Sutra, all the other teachings that the Buddha gave. By understanding the Lamrim, we can see how everything the Buddha ever taught fits within its topics, and that each topic is designed to lead us closer and closer to liberation and enlightenment. Until we can deeply understand this, it might seem that some things that the Buddha taught lack relevance, that they belong to an ancient culture that is no longer applicable to us, but that is not true. Every word is completely relevant. So then he kind of talks about the qualities uh, or the attributes of the Lamrim, which is that we can understand that the small scope is meant for practitioners of a particular mind, a particular motivation. The middle scope is meant for practitioners of a more mature motivation, and the great scope is meant for practitioners of the highest, most mature, most sophisticated motivation. And that understanding that it guides a single person over time through different stages of their own development, we can abandon having partiality for some of the teachings, and thinking that other aspects of the teachings are not meant for us. Oh, I'm a Mahayana practitioner. The great scope is what I do. Small scope is what other people do. We avoid making that kind of mistake when we realize that the teachings guide all people through all of the stages at different points in time, rather than thinking that we only need to practice a certain subset of them. We engage in the practices held in common with practitioners of the small scope. Then we engage in practices held in common with practitioners of the middle scope. And then we engage in the great scope once we mature into the great scope. So we hold the great scope as the ideal, as the end point, but we understand every teaching has a unique role to play in transforming our mind over time at different points, and that it is appropriate, it will become appropriate when we reach that point for us to practice in that particular way. And then the next contemplation is actually on the Sangha jewel, not a different contemplation on the Dharma jewel. So here we're talking about the Arya Sangha. So here so he's saying that technically, we can talk about, because we talked about all of this before, how there's a common way of referring to Sangha as the practitioners of a particular temple, and then a little bit more technical ways to refer to monks and nuns, but the Arya Sangha is what's meant by the refuge jewel of the Sangha, and that refers to also, you could say, the absolute Sangha and the relative Sangha. The relative Sangha are, just people who are also practicing, people who are trying to be helpful, but then the absolute Sangha, but those people are just like us. They're trying, but they haven't seen the nature of reality directly, so they make all kinds of mistakes, and so they aren't meant to be relied upon as the Sangha jewel. Only those who have had a direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness are reliable enough to be considered the Dharma jewel. The Sangha jewel. So, to some degree, we have to rely on the relative Sangha. There isn't to say that the relative Sangha doesn't have any useful role. Certainly, if people have read more than we have, they've received teachings that we can look to them for some advice, some guidance, but they'll make mistakes, and so we really need to try to. So we think of them as helpful companions, helpful students, but we don't take refuge in them. We don't see them in the same way. We don't relate to them as, a real source of true guidance, true protection. But, certainly we can study the texts with our friends and discuss and debate and get really helpful feedback and support on our journey from all of those people, but we just don't think of them as a source of refuge. That we do when we have a sense, at least. Of course, we don't know who has or who has not had a direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness, but for those that, but it is also true that only by having that realization does a person, irrespective of whether they're a layperson or a monastic, do they become the Arya Sangha, the refuge jewel. So Lama Zopa says, true Sangha can look like anything. If long-haired hippies with bushy beards have realized emptiness, they can be Sangha. Any thoughts, questions on Sangha jewel? Yep, Aaron.
So when we talk about the Sangha jewel, are you really talking about the true paths that the Sangha follows that enable that direct experience?
That's kind of more like the Dharma jewel. So with the Sangha jewel, we're talking about our ability to be benefited kind of interpersonally, or so it's referring really to people that we would know in on the earth alive presently, that we are able to get teachings from, that we're able to ask questions from, to get advice from. And so it's of course the Dharma that enabled that, but it's also the Dharma that enabled them to become the Buddha jewel as well. So but here we're talking mainly about the people who've had that direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness. And because of that, the guidance, the advice, the feedback that they give us is coming from someone who is seeing reality very, very clearly without the veils of ignorance that are clouding our mind and the minds of other, ordinary practitioners and so on. So, of course, there's still a difference between the kind of, we relate to the Buddha as, so there's still a distinction that we would draw between how we would take refuge in the Buddha jewel versus how we would take refuge in the Sangha jewel, because there's a difference between someone who has seen emptiness directly and someone who's gone all the way to full enlightenment. Those are still different things. So they talk about the Buddha being like the great physician, and the Sangha being like the nurses that understand how to take the prescription that the Buddha is giving us. They can give us sort of the instruction, but they aren't necessarily, we would still have a greater, an even greater sense of refuge or confidence in the Buddha jewel, because a person who's seen emptiness directly, they're not yet enlightened. And so there are still subtle obscurations that can exist in their mind. And so, because you become an Arya Bodhisattva perhaps, but then you still have all of the grounds and paths of an Arya Bodhisattva to progress through. And on the Bodhisattva grounds and paths, you are continuing to steep the mind in the direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness. And by doing that, you purify the mind in a, I guess, relatively linear way. And so you make fewer and fewer mistakes. You are prone to fewer and fewer, afflicted states over that time. But there's a big difference between a bodhisattva on the first ground and a fully enlightened being. So even between like the seventh, the eighth, ninth, even the high level bodhisattvas, there are changes that take place. There are, they become increasingly more reliable and less prone to mistakes and so on. So still, but so we kind of reserve some things for, we reserve some levels of that confidence for the Buddha rather than the Sangha, because they're not, their minds are certainly, they're seeing things much more clear than we are, and so they are, their advice is much more sound, but they're still, they are not omniscient, they don't have the qualities of a Buddha, and so they don't seek, they don't understand karma directly. There's limitations. So, any other? So, in day 150, the next contemplation, Lama Zopa is going to kind of join these three sources, these three jewels, into presenting the topic as a whole. He says, the historical Buddha is the one in whom we take refuge and is thus the cause of our own enlightenment, the causal refuge. This is true of all the Buddhas, not just Shakyamuni Buddha. The end result, the resultant refuge, is our own Buddhahood. And therefore, the absolute Buddha is the omniscient mind itself, ours or anybody else's. This is the wisdom or truth body, the Dharmakaya, one of the holy bodies of a Buddha. The absolute Dharma is the wisdom directly perceiving emptiness, which is the true path that eliminates the disturbing thought obscurations. He says morality is not enough, concentration is not enough, and neither is a conceptual understanding of emptiness. We must have a direct realization of emptiness. This is the actual refuge that saves us from the suffering of samsara. When we have this direct realization of emptiness, we have obtained the absolute Dharma. He says we have no way of taking teachings directly from the Buddha, but we have the great yogis and pandits who followed him. They realized liberation and enlightenment using his methods and are therefore the ones we can rely on, our Sangha refuge. Those who have high realizations are the absolute Sangha. Those who have not yet to attain realizations but are on the path are the conventional Sangha. Ultimately, what will save us is our own inner Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, our Buddha nature and the realizations we have. However, at present, we need the help of the external Dharma, Buddha, and Sangha. The Buddha, his teachings, and the spiritual community, those who can share the teachings with us and inspire us by their example. So, and again, that's why, like in the refuge prayer, it says, I go for refuge until I am enlightened, because then we become the refuge. And so we have this causal refuge and the resultant refuge. We need to rely on the Buddha, his teachings, and the community of practitioners who've realized his teachings. But the purpose of that is to actualize the teachings within our own mind, to provide the causes and the conditions for oneself to become the Sangha jewel and then to become the Buddha jewel by relying on these external sources of refuge. But we give that up once we become that either Sangha jewel or eventually the Buddha jewel. We will become both of those as we progress through the stages of training. And but then we don't continue to take refuge. The purpose of refuge is that it's a vehicle for being able to generate the realizations of the path in our own mind, and then we ourselves are the Sangha jewel, and we ourselves would become the Buddha jewel. So day 151, the quotation is, Lord Buddha is the ultimate physician. And then Lama Yeshe says the three objects of refuge are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Taking refuge in the Buddha involves accepting the guidance of an enlightened being as the only remedy for the confusion and dissatisfaction of our present life. If we are convinced that we are beyond hope and incapable of change, or if we think we are already perfect, then there's no reason to take refuge. But if we honestly examine our mind, our way of life, and the pattern of our relationships, we can clearly recognize, he says, our own spiritual sickness, which is kind of a intense phrasing, but the enlightened being we turn to at this point is, in effect, the doctor who diagnoses our ailments and restores us to perfect health. The medicine described by the Buddha is the Dharma. Dharma is wisdom, the wisdom that understands our true nature and reveals our own latent power of self-liberation. Taking refuge in Dharma means using that wisdom now. This will restore our hitherto obscured sense of human dignity and make us feel that we can, after all, do something positive about ourselves. Those who take deep refuge never feel lost or desperate. Refuge frees us from such abject mental states. As our self-respect and our confidence increases, our relationships with others improve. Having discovered our own inner strength, we also recognize and respect the Buddha nature in others. Sangha consists of those who are endowed with wisdom. They are like the nurses and friends who help us recuperate from an illness. Sangha is not only those who wear red and yellow robes, but also those friends who influence us beneficially. These spiritual friends energize and inspire us and are therefore clearly distinguished from ordinary friends. Anything from today that there's a question about?
It seems pretty straightforward.
All right. Let's see, that might be a good stopping point for today. Anything else that would be helpful to look at today? Nope. All right. So we'll leave it there for today. So we'll just end with dedication. So we recollect the altruistic motivation that we established. And think that by having listened and participated, contemplated these topics, we've actualized a positive motivation, which has created positive energy in the mind. We have a sense of letting that positive energy go, thinking may it ripen in whatever ways truly beneficial for sentient beings. So, on your own, visualize all of the incredibly vast, beneficial ways that you are offering up your own practice for the benefit of countless sentient beings, visualizing it ripening. Seeing the karmic result of one's practice in all of those vast beneficial ways. All right. We will continue. Trying to see how much. Yeah, we've got a few more days left in this topic. All right, so I will see everyone again on Thursday.